Hello, everybody. Hope everybody is staying safe. I've just gotten my coronavirus update today. It's Friday, March 27th, and I am going to continue to read My Cave Life in Vicksburg. It was a book written by Mary Webster Loughborough when she resided, a Missourian who resided in Mississippi during the spring of 1863. And of course, at that time, the Union Army starts bombarding the city of Vicksburg to capture it so they have access to all of the Mississippi River during the Civil War. And so people took to living in caves, and some of these caves were very small, some were very big. And where we are in the story is the group of people that Mary is residing with have now moved to a cave close to the battlefield. If anybody's been at Vicksburg, you have the hillock with a lot of the um, remnants of some of these caves that are seen from the Mississippi River, and then um, that's where the bombardments were happening with the Federal Navy. And then on the other side of the township, you have the battlefield. Where Confederate Army is entrenching to make sure that the town is not captured from that angle. So her group is now moved to closer to the battlefield. So it's now June of 1863. So I will start with chapter 19. A servant brought me one day a present from an officer that was acceptable indeed. Two large yellow ripe June apples sealed in a large envelope. They were as much of a variety to me as pineapples would have been. On another occasion, a gentleman sent me 4 large slices of ham, having been fortunate enough to procure a small piece himself. Now and then, gentlemen in calling would bring to my little girl and myself some little article that was impossible to procure, and only those who have undergone little, like privations can understand how truly grateful we felt for these little kindnesses. One day a friend brought us some fruit that had been presented to him. While we were conversing, my little hunger besieged 2-year-old daughter quietly secured it and sitting on the floor ate with avidity. When she had finished nearly all of it, she turned around with a bright and well satisfied face to me, saying, "Mamma, it's so good," the first intimation that I had that my portion had disappeared. Dear child, I trembled for her in the greater trials I believed in store for us. Fruits and vegetables were not to be procured at any price. Every one felt foreboding of a more serious trouble, the great fear of starvation that stared all in the face, causing those who possessed any article in the shape of edibles to retain it for that period to which all looked forward with anxiety, when we would come to actual want. Already the men in the pits were on half rations. Flour or meal enough to furnish bread equivalent in quantity to 2 biscuits in 2 days. Many of them ate it all at once, and the next day fasted, preferring, as they said, to have one good meal. So they sat cramped up all day in the pits, their rations cooked in the valley and brought to them, scarcely daring to change their positions and stand erect, for the Federal sharpshooters were watching for the heads, and to rise above the breastworks was almost certain death. Frequently a parrot shell would penetrate the entrenchments, and exploding caused frightful wounds, and death most frequently. "Ah," said M., one day, "it is to the noble men in the rifle pits that Vicksburg will owe aught of honor she may gain in the siege. I revere them, as I see them undergoing every privation with courage and patience, anxious only for the high reputation of the city. They amuse themselves, while lying in the pits, by cutting out little trinkets from the wood of the parapet and the many balls that fell around them. Major Fry from Texas excelled in skill and ready imitation, I think. He sent me one day an armchair that he had cut from a Minnie ball, the most minute affair of the kind I ever saw, yet perfectly symmetrical. At another time he sent me a diminutive plough made from the parapet wood, with traces of lead and a lead point made from a Minnie ball. I had often remarked how cheerfully the soldiers bore the hardships of the siege. I saw them often passing with their little sacks containing scanty rations, whistling and chatting pleasantly as around them thickly flew the balls and shells. Poor men, yet so badly used and undergoing so many privations. Chapter 20. The clouds had been darkening around us all day, and night we had the prospect of a storm. M sent George out with a spade to slope the earth about the roof of our home and widen the water ditch around it. Yet it was not until the next morning that the rain began falling. By daylight I heard M giving orders rapidly about packing the earth firmly, deepening the ditch, and watching the rear of the cave. I opened my eyes to see without darkness and gloom of a rainy day, to feel the dampness of the mist upon my face, and to behold M standing at the entrance, with the movable articles near him piled out of reach of the driving rain, giving orders to George in regard to our doubly besieged fortress. I lay and listened to the dropping and plashing with a dreamy pleasure at first. But hearing M start out to see if all were right, I sprang up, thinking I might assist in keeping out the water. It was a very fortunate move, for I had scarcely begun dressing when the earth gave away at the head of my bed, and a perfect spout of muddy water burst through the embankment and fell in the center of the resting place I had so lately left. To run and call M to stop the water in the back part of the cave, and in the greatest haste to assist Synth in removing every article that was at all dry, and let the water have free course through, was the work of an instant. Yet in the short time that the water had flowed through the cave, we presented a miserably deluged appearance. Trunks were piled on trunks, lines hanging from log to log on the roof, filled with the dropping carpet, blankets, sheets, and miscellaneous articles, dripping with the dreary patter on the floor. Chairs turned up together and packed out of the way, our homelike arrangements all in disorder. And now that the water had been turned that flowed through the cave, I and the servant sat, disconsolately, with our skirts drawn around and our feet on little blocks of wood to keep them out of the mud, with rueful faces, regarding the sweeping of the water and plashing of rain without. The water having overflowed the sides of the ditch, making a new channel, and pouring down at the entrance, had completely washed away our little terrace, leaving a huge and yawning gulf immediately in front of us. I was thus contemplating sorrowfully the ruins of our little home, when M came down, bringing cheer to us again in the expression of his bright, strong, and calm face. The water was flowing in little streams from his hat down to his coat, flowing over his coat, and making little pools on the floor as he stood. He declared that the storm was nearly over, and that we would have some breakfast in spite of it. Taking his hat from his head, and shaking the water from it and from his hair, he bade George take a spade and cut a fireplace near the entrance, bring us up his camp kettles, which were full of water, kindle a large fire, and have the breakfast on. He congratulated me upon the perfect safety of our residence, that the water was running around it in regular Venetian style, and that for the present we were perfectly waterproof. Indeed, our home was in a precarious situation on a rainy day, for we were planted in the bed of the torrent of water that drained from the hill above. Yet M assured me that now we had nothing to fear, for with George he had packed the earth perfectly firm and secure. He laughed heartily at my narrow escape, for I declared that I should never have felt in a pleasant humor again if that rush of muddy water had fallen on me. Soon the fire blazed cheerfully up, and George commenced the preparation of our simple breakfast, M going out to attend to some reports. I had always looked forward to the prospect of rain with pleasure, as procuring us some respite from the incessant noise of explosions, and from the whistling and falling of balls. The fury of the storm had scarcely abated when the tumult and din of the Federal batteries and musketry recommenced, and far from the rain extinguishing the fuse of the shell, there seemed to be an unusually large number falling this morning. I began to feel thoroughly thawed and revived when George set the breakfast on the table and M came in, so we sat down quite gaily in spite of the continued falling of the rain. The pleasant fire was doing its work, and the earth was rapidly hardening around us. M told me of a colonel of one of the regiments stationed at the foot of one of the fortified hills, who unfortunately slept too long, and the turbulent rush of the waters down the hill broke through all barriers, enveloping him completely in mud, water, sand, and sediment. He sprang from the ground in a towering rage, and could scarcely be persuaded that he was not the victim of a practical joke. So soundly he had slept that he was entirely oblivious of the storm, and could scarcely believe his rude awakening the work of the elements. M told me also with a grave face of the poor soldiers he had seen in the rifle pits that morning, standing in water, some with little pieces of carpet drawn around them, others with nothing but their thin clothes, which were saturated, and there they would lie through the day with only the meal of yesterday to sustain them. Chapter 21. I am told by my friends who call that I am looking worn and pale, and frequently asked if I am not weary of this cave life. I parry the question as well as possible, for I do not like to admit it for M's sake. Yet I am tired and weary, ah, so weary. I never was made to exist underground, and when I am obliged to what wonder that I vegetate, like other unfortunate plants, grow wan, spindly, and white. Yet I must reason with myself. I had chosen this life of suffering with one I love, and what suffering after all have I experienced? Privations in the way of good and wholesome food, not half what the poor people around us are experiencing. A fear of those can kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. I will not be unnerved. I have no right to complain. Wherever he hath placed me, there will I be found in his strength, and hereafter I will be brave and steadfast. To reason with myself in this time of danger was one of the chief employments of my cave life. Time passes on, and all say the siege cannot last much longer, and still we are here, and still the deafening noise of shells, and the variety of missiles that are thrown fall, scattering death in all directions. About this time the town was aroused by the arrival of a courier from General Johnston, who brought private dispatches to General Pemberton, the nature of which did not transpire. Yet from the very silence of General Pemberton the officers augured the worst. The courier brought many letters to the inhabitants from friends without. His manner of entering the city was singular. Taking a skiff in the Yazoo, he proceeded to its confluence with the Mississippi, where he tied the little boat, entered the woods, and awaited the night. At dark he took off his clothing, placed his dispatches securely within them, bound the package firmly to a plank, and going into the river, he sustained his head above the water by holding to the plank, and in this manner floated in the darkness through the fleet, and on 2 miles down the river of Vicksburg, where his arrival was hailed as an event of great importance in the still life of the city. The hill opposite our cave might be called Death's Point, from the number of animals that had been killed in eating the grass on the sides and summit. In all directions I could see the turf turned up from the shells that have gone plowing into the earth. Horses or mules that are tempted to mount the hill by the promise of grass that grows profusely there, invariably come limping down wounded to die at the base, or are brought down dead from the summit. A certain number of mules are killed each day by the commissaries, and are issued to the men, all of whom prefer the fresh meat, though it be of mule, to the bacon and salt rations that they have eaten for so long a time without change. There have already been some cases of scurvy. The soldiers have a horror of the disease. Therefore, I suppose, the mule meat is all the more welcome. Indeed, I petitioned M to have some served on our table. He said, "No, wait a little longer." He did not like to see me eating mule until I was obliged to, and he trusted Providence would send us some change shortly. That very afternoon I was looking out on the opposite hill where the shells were falling frequently. I noticed a very large fine cow slowly grazing on the side, and ascending higher and higher as she moved. It was a matter of wonder with me where she came from, for beef cattle of all kinds had disappeared from Vicksburg. The cow was in fine condition, and I thought, poor creature, you are not prudent in eating such dangerous grass. A short time before tea, M came up laughing and said, "Providence has indeed sent you fresh meat, so that you will not have to depend upon mule. A fine cow has been killed by a shell on the opposite hill. The general has taken the meat, and a large share has been sent to you." I regretted the fate of the animal that I had so lately seen vigorous with life. Yet now, since fate was so unkind, I gladly received my portion, thinking of the old saw, "It's an ill wind," etc. George and some of the boys in the camp cut the meat in strips, and I was able to send some soup meat to the courier that rode continually among the shower of balls, and to a poor humped-backed soldier whose strength was giving way from the privation he had undergone. The remainder was rubbed with saltpetre, strung on canes laid across frames, with a slow fire underneath, and the heat of the sun and the fire combined jerked it nicely for future use. I laughed heartily at the appearance of the cave a day or two after the process. The logs of the roof were hung with festoons of jerked meat that swung gracefully and constantly above us, and walking around under it I felt quite like an Indian. I suppose, after a successful chase, that starvation for a while was far in the background. It was astonishing how the young officers kept up their spirits, frequently singing quartets and glees amid the pattering of many balls, and I often heard gay peals of laughter from headquarters, as the officers that had spent the day and perhaps the night previous in the rifle pits would collect to make out reports. This evening a gentleman visited us and among other songs sang words to the air of the Mockingbird, which I will write. 'Twas at the siege of Vicksburg, of Vicksburg, of Vicksburg, 'twas at the siege of Vicksburg, when the parrot shells were whistling through the air. Listen to the parrot shells, listen to the parrot shells are whistling through the air. Oh, well will we remember, 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 tough mule meat, June saw November, and the minnie bell balls that whistle through the air. Listen to the minnie balls, listen to the minnie balls are singing in the air. Songs of every description are composed in honor of narrow escapes, unlucky incidents, brave deeds, etc. Songs, humorous, pathetic, and tragic, are sung in every manner of voice, sometimes hoarse with surprising loudness and depth, again with richly modulated tones and much soft volume and melody. All sing according to differently accustomed tastes. I heard one night a soldier down the ravine singing one of the weird melodious hymns that negroes often sing, and amid the firing and crashing of projectiles it floated up to me in soft musical undertones that were fascinating in the extreme. The wailing of the earthly unrest, the longing for the glorious home that the warm imagery pictures to be glorious in golden lights and silvery radiance, of song and brilliant happiness. The voice was full and triumphant. Then the rapid changed, in low and mournful cadence, to the earth, the clay, the mire, to dearth, to suffering, to sin. "I wonder, Lord, will I ever get to heaven, to the New Jerusalem?" came with the ending of every verse. I bowed my face in my hands. Yes, heaven was so far off. Yet he that cometh to me I will now in no wise cast out. Our grasp is firm, but our eyes are blind. Some day after the earthly longings are stilled, we will know the exceeding glory. Though singing songs of every description, yet how often we are made to feel that any moment the summons may come. I was sewing one day near one side of the cave where the black slopes and lights up the room like a window. Near this opening I was sitting when I suddenly remembered some little article I wished in another part of the room. Crossing to procure it, I was returning when a minnie ball came whizzing through the opening, past my chair, and fell beyond it. Had I been still sitting, I should have stopped it. Conceive how speedily I took the chair into another part of the room and sat in it. Chapter 22. One evening I noticed one of the horses tied in the ravine acting very strangely, writhing and struggling as if in pain. One of the soldiers went to him and found that he was very badly wounded in the flank by a minnie ball. The poor creature's agony was dreadful. He would reach his head up as far as possible into the tree to which he was tied, and cling with his mouth while his neck and body quivered with the pain. Every motion, instead of being violent as most horses would have been when wounded, had a stately grace of eloquent suffering that is indescribable. I wanted to go to him and pat and soothe him. The halter was taken off and he was turned free. Going to a tree, he leaned his body against it and moaned with half-closed eyes, shivering frequently throughout his huge body as if the pain were too great to bear. Then, turning his head entirely around, he would gaze at the group of soldiers that stood pityingly near, as if he was looking for human sympathy. The master refused to have him shot, hoping he would recover, but it must have been evident that his day was the last of his strong, proud life. The noble black was doomed. After the gentle faithfulness of his service, it was cruel to prolong his suffering. After the simple meals of mulberry leaves, with scarcely sustenance enough to maintain life, why should this pain and agony be permitted to rack his already weakened body? These truths were set aside, and the master looked with pity, yet it seemed a selfish pity. Becoming restless with the pain, the poor brute staggered blindly on, and now my eyes fill with tears, for he has fallen with a weary moan between the banks of the little rivulet in the ravine, his head thrown on the sod, and the bright, intelligent eye turned still upon the men who have been his comrades in many a battle, standing still near him. Poor fellow! Those low and frequent moans and trembling limbs tell them that death has stricken you already, that you are far beyond human sympathy. In the midst of all the falling shells, cannot one reach him, giving him peace and death? I see an axe handed to one of the bystanders, and turn suddenly away from the scene. The quick, soft strike. I know it must be over. Again I look, and the glossy black body is being taken out from our sight, to be replaced by new sufferings, and to be forgotten in new incidents. There is one missile were I a soldier that would totally put me to rout, and that is a shrapnel shell. Only those who have heard several coming at a time, exploding near and scattering hundreds of small balls around them, can tell how fearful the noise they make, a wild scream, a clattering and whizzing sound that never fails in striking terror to my heart. It seems sometimes that as many as 50 balls fell immediately around our door. I could have sent out at any time near the entrance of our cave, and it had a bucket full of balls from shrapnel and the mini rifle, picked up in the shortest possible time. One old gray-headed, cheerful-hearted soldier whom I had talked with often was passing through the ravine for water immediately opposite our cave. A Minnie ball struck him in the lower part of the leg. He coolly stooped down, tied his handkerchief around it, and passed on. So constantly fell projectiles of all descriptions that I became almost indifferent to them. Only the hideous noise of numerous shrapnel could startle me now. Generally at 4 o'clock in the morning the shrapnel were thrown more furiously than any other time through the day. At about 7 the Minnie balls began falling, accompanied by parrot, canister, solid shot, and shrapnel shells, and through every minute in the day this constant play of artillery and musketry was kept up from the Federal lines. General Pemberton had ordered the Confederate batteries to remain silent unless particular orders were given to fire or an assault was made on the works. One afternoon, I remember so vividly, one of the sergeants of the staff was chatting with him when I heard a rushing and peculiar sound as if someone were rapidly cutting through the air, near and around me with a sword. Both the doctor and M sprang to their feet as the sound grew more confused, seeming as if the sudden rush of a volume of water was pouring down the hill. I saw M turn to the doctor and say, "They're coming." I dared not ask any questions, yet I at first supposed the entrenchments were taken. And without a word drew on another coat and threw the linen one he had worn to me with a laugh. I suppose I must have looked rather wild, for I could not tell or imagine the meaning of the confusing and singular noise around us. Taking his sword, M started immediately. I feared every moment that he would fall, for the balls fell like hail. I turned to the doctor, questioning, "Are they coming over the hill?" He laughed and said, "Oh, no, they are only making a charge on the entrenchments, and the rushing in the air you hear is the numerous small balls flying over us." The strange, bewildering sound lasted for some time. The doctor soon took his leave, saying that the wounded would be brought in for him to attend. I sat for half an hour hearing the constant rushing and surging around me, and the quick dropping of balls. The ground trembled from the frequent discharge of the Confederate cannon. What was likely to be the result I could not tell, for the ravine below, lately so full of animation, seemed to be totally deserted, save now and then the rapid gallop of a courier through the shower of balls along the road. Soon there came a gradual cessation, quieting more and more down to the old interval of a minute between the discharges. Soon M came home, reporting 1 or 2 wounded and 1 killed. It seems miraculous to me that amid such a shower of balls so few persons should be injured. Chapter 23. A few days after the assault on the Confederate fortifications, a sad accident cast a gloom over all of the little community encamped in the ravine, officers, soldiers, and servants. A soldier named Henry had noticed my little girl often bringing her flowers at one time, an apple at another, and again a young mockingbird, and had attached her to him much by these little kindnesses. Frequently on seeing him pass she would call his name and clap her hands gleefully as he rode the General's handsome horse for water, causing him to prance past the cave for her amusement. She called my attention to him one morning, saying, "Oh, mamma, look at Henry's horse, how he plays." He was riding a small black horse that was exceedingly wild and striving to accustom it to the rapid evolutions of the Texas troops, turning in his saddle to grasp something from the ground as he moved speedily on. Soon after, he rode the horse for water, and I saw him return and fasten it to a tree. Afterward, I saw him come down the hill opposite with an unexploded shrapnel shell in his hand. In a few moments I heard a quick explosion in the ravine, followed by a cry, a sudden agonized cry. I ran to the entrance and saw a courier whom I had noticed frequently passing by roll slowly over into the rivulet of the ravine and lie motionless at a little distance. Henry, oh poor Henry, holding out his mangled arms, the hands torn and hanging from the bleeding ghastly wrists, a fearful wound in his head, the blood pouring from his wounds. Shot, gasping, wild, he staggered around, crying piteously, "Where are you, boys? Oh, boys, where are you? Oh, I am hurt, I am hurt. Boys, come to me, come to me. God have mercy. Almighty God have mercy." My little girl clung to my dress, saying, "Oh, mamma, poor Henny's killed. Now he'll die, mamma. Oh, poor Henny." I carried her away from the painful sight. My first impulse was to run down to them with the few remedies I possessed. Then I thought of the crowd of soldiers around the men, and if Mem should see me there, the only lady, he might think I did wrong. So I sent my servant with camphor and other slight remedies I possessed, and turned into my cave with a sickened heart. In a few moments the litters passed by, going toward the hospital, the blood streaming from that of Henry, who still moaned and cried for the boys to come to him, and for God to pity him. But the other bore the still motionless body of the young courier, who in the strength of his life had been so suddenly stricken. It seems that the two men had been trying to take out the screw from an unexploded shell for the purpose of securing the powder. In turning it, the fuse had become ignited, communicating the fire to the powder, and the fatal explosion ensued. Henry had been struck in the head by a fragment, his hands torn from his arms, one or two fragments had also lodged in his body. The courier had been struck in two places in his head, and a number of balls had entered his body. Poor soldier! His mother lived in Yazoo City, and he was her only son. So near was she, yet unable to hold his head and set the seal of her love on his lips ere the breath fled from them forever. He lived until the sun went down, speaking no word, making no moan. Only the quickly drawn breath told that life still flickered in the mangled body. Henry died also that night, still unconscious of the sorrowful comrades around his bed, still calling on God to pity him. After the bodies of the wounded men had been carried away, we heard loud wailings and cries in the direction of the city. I was told a negro woman in walking through the yard had been struck by a fragment shell and instantly killed. The screams of the women of Vicksburg were the saddest I have ever heard. The wailings over the dead seemed full of heart-sick agony. I cannot attempt to describe the thrill of pity mingled with fear that pierced my soul, as suddenly vibrating through the air would come these sorrowful shrieks, these pitiful moans, sometimes almost simultaneously with the explosion of a shell. This anguish over the dead and wounded was particularly low and mournful, perhaps from the depression. Many women were utterly sick through constant fear and apprehension. It is strange that the ladies were almost constantly in caves, and yet did one go out for a short time, she was almost certain to be wounded, while the officers and soldiers rode and walked about, with very little destruction of life ensuing. An officer was telling me of two soldiers near his camp who had been severely wounded by Minnie balls, one shot through the head and lung, the other through his side. A new cause for apprehension came to me about this time. The mortar boats were endeavoring to throw their bombs as far as the entrenchments, and almost succeeded. I could see them at night falling near the opposite hill, and I was in a constant state of trepidation, lest they should be cast still near us. After witnessing the brilliant streams of light that they created in the heavens one night, and feeling repeatedly thankful that they always fell short of the hill we inhabited, I gradually grew sleepy in utter loneliness, for M seldom finished receiving reports until 11. I rarely turned to the little mattress on the floor, said my prayers, and retired. I had been sleeping some time, for the moon was shining brightly, when I was awakened by loud cries and screams. Where shall we go? Oh, where shall we go? My immediate conclusion was that some woman had been killed or wounded, as every now and then I could see the mortar shells dropping on the hill opposite. I therefore thought I had been spared in Vicksburg as long as I reasonably could hope, for the variety of changes through which I had passed, and immediately I was seized with a severe panic. If shells had not been falling from the battlefield also, I fear I should have started in that direction. So great was my dread of the mortars, and run, I cared not where out of their range. But the counter awe of parrot shells kept me where I was. I sat up in bed in a fearful state of excitement, called to M again and again without the slightest response. At last, in a sleepily uttered, "What is the matter?" gave me an opportunity of informing him that we would all be killed, and telling him, while the cold moisture of fear broke out over my forehead, that the mortar shells were nearer than ever, and that the next one would probably fall upon our cave. Awakened at last to my distressed state of mind, and hearing me say that I knew some woman had been killed, he got up, dressed, took up his cab, and went out to see what had happened, telling me he would return shortly, looking back, laughing as he went, and saying to me that I was fearfully demoralized for so good a soldier. He soon returned, telling me that a negro man had been killed at the entrance of a cave a little beyond us, toward the city, that his mistress' wife and the young ladies of the family were very badly frightened, having taken refuge in the adjutant's office. Chapter 24. The next day the family were invited up to our cave, and the lady told me with tears of the death of the faithful old man who had served her mother before her. The morning of the day he died, he called her to him and said, "Mistress, I feel like I ain't going to live much longer. Tell young master when you see him that I've been praying for him this day. Tell him it smites my heart mightily to think I won't see his young face this day with the children. Please tell the young folks and mistis to come and let me pray with them." "Oh, uncle," the mistress answered, "don't talk that way. You will live many years yet, I hope." The young ladies were called and knelt while he prayed for them, and all he loved shaking hands with them and speaking to each one separately as they left. His cave was next to his mistress's. That night he sat smoking his pipe near the entrance when a mortar shell exploding near sent a fragment into the old man's side, rending it open and tearing away his hip. He lived a few moments and was carried into the cave. Turning to his mistress while he shook his head, he said, "Don't stay here, mistis. I said the Lord wanted me." And so the good old Christian died. When he had breathed his last, a sudden panic seized them, for the shell after shell fell near them, and they all ran. Some of the gentlemen, hearing them cry, brought them to headquarters. The next day the news came that one of the forts to the left of us had been undermined and blown up, killing 60 men. Then of the death of the gallant Colonel Irwin of Missouri, and again the next day the death of the brave old General Greene of Missouri. We were now swiftly nearing the end of our siege life. The rations had nearly all been given out. For the last few days I had been sick, still I tried to overcome the languid feeling of utter prostration. My little one had swung in her hammock, reduced in strength, with a low fever flushing her face, and was all anxiety, I could plainly see. A soldier brought up one morning a little jaybird as a plaything for the child. After playing with it for a short time, she turned wearily away. "Miss Mary," said the servant, "she's hungry. Let her make her some soup from the bird." At first I refused. The poor little plaything should not die. Then as I thought of the child, I half consented. With the utmost haste, Cynth disappeared, and the next time she appeared it was with a cup of soup and a little plate on which lay the white meat of the poor little bird. On Saturday a painful calm prevailed. There had been a truce proclaimed, and so long had the constant firing been kept up that the stillness now was absolutely oppressive. At 10 o'clock General Bowen passed by dressed in full uniform, accompanied by Colonel Montgomery, and preceded by a courier bearing a white flag. M came by and asked me if I would like to walk out, so put on my bonnet and sallied forth beyond the terrace. For the first time since I entered, on the hill above us the earth was literally covered with fragments of shells, Parrott, shrapnel, canister, besides lead in all shapes and forms, and a long kind of solid shot shaped like a small parrot shell. Many balls lay in every direction, flattened, dented, and bent from the contact with trees and pieces of wood in their flight. The grass seemed deadened, the ground plowed into furrows in many places, while scattered over all, like giant's pepper, in numberless quantity with the shrapnel shells. I could now see how very near to the rifle pits my cave lay. Only a small ravine between the two hills separated us. In about 2 hours General Bowen returned. No one knew or seemed to know why a truce had been made, but all believed that a treaty of surrender was pending. Nothing was talked about among the officers but the all engrossing theme. Many wished to cut their way out and make the rest their own, but I secretly hoped that no such bloody hazard would be attempted. The next morning M came up with a pale face, saying, "It's all over. The white flag floats from our forts. Vicksburg has surrendered." He put on his uniform coat, silently buckled on his sword, and prepared to take out the men to deliver up their arms in front of the fortification. I felt a strange unrest. The quiet of the day was so unnatural. I walked up and down the cave until M returned. The day was extremely warm, and he came with a violent headache. He told me that the Federal troops had acted splendidly. They were stationed opposite the place where the Confederate troops marched up and stacked their arms. And he seemed to feel sorry for the poor fellows who had defended the place for so long a time. Far different what he had expected. Not a jeer or taunt came from any one of the Federal soldiers. Occasionally a cheer would be heard, but the majority seemed to regard the poor unsuccessful soldiers with a generous sympathy. After the surrender, the old gray-headed soldier, in passing on the hill near the cave, stopped, and touching his hat, said, "It's a sad day this, madam. I little thought we'd come to it, when we first stopped in the entrenchments. I hope you'll yet be happy, madam, that after all the trouble you've seen." To which I mentally responded, "Amen." The poor hunchback soldier who had been sick and who at home in southern Missouri is worth $1,000,000. I have been told, yet within Vicksburg has been nearly starved, walked out today in the pleasant air for the first time for many days. I stood in the doorway and caught my first sight of the Federal uniforms since the surrender. That afternoon the road was filled with them, walking about, looking at the forts and the headquarters horses. Wagons also filled the road, drawn by the handsome United States horses. Poor M, after keeping his horse upon mulberry leaves during the 48 days, saw him no more. After the surrender in the evening, George rode into the city on his mule, thinking to shine, as the negroes say. He rode M's handsome silver-mounted dragoon saddle. I could not help laughing when he returned with a sorry face, reporting himself safe, but the saddle gone. M questioned and re-questioned him, aghast at his loss, for a saddle was a valuable article in our little community, and George, who felt as badly as any one, said, "I met a Yankee who told me, 'Get down off dat mule. I'm going to have dat saddle.' I said, 'No, I ain't going to do no such thing.' He took out his pistol and I jumped down." So Mr. George brought back to M a saddle that better befitted his mule than the one he rode off on, a much worn, common affair made of wood. I felt sorry for M. That evening George brought evil news again. Another horse had been taken. His remaining horse and his only saddle finished the news of the day. The next morning, Monday, as I was passing through the cave, I saw something stirring at the base of one of the supports of the roof. Taking a second look, I beheld a large snake curled between the earth and the upright post. I went out quickly and sent one of the servants for M, who, coming up immediately, took up his sword and fastened one of the folds of the reptile to the post. It gave one quick dart toward him with open jaws. Fortunately, the length of the sword was greater than the upper length of the body. and the snake fell to the earth a few inches from him, who set his heel firmly on it and severed the head from the body with a sword. I never seen so large a snake. It was fully as large round the body as the bowl of a good-sized glass tumbler, and over 2 yards long. Chapter 25. In the afternoon, Em went into the city with some of the officers to make arrangements for me. I was much amused, though I did not let them see it, as they set off on their poor mulberry-fed horses. Em had been presented by some, after the loss of his horse, with a little lame, subdued-looking animal to whom food of any kind seemed a rarity, and the poor horse ambled along as if he considered his weight a great affliction. Our whole little household had been drawn out to witness the departure of the brilliant cavalcade. Afterwards, as I sat with a book at the entrance, I heard steps, and looking up, I saw a large burly negro with a most disagreeable face dressed in Federal uniform, and armed coming up the little path that led to the cave. As he advanced toward me, I sprang to my feet, but George, who was luckily near, crossed over from the sassafras bed, carving knife in hand, with which he was digging some of the root. Standing between us, he said, "Where you going, old man?" "None of your business," he returned, pausing a moment. I was just on the point of calling some of the gentlemen at headquarters, when he turned and went round the cave on the hill. "I make dis knife show you what's your business," growled George. Poor George! He had been my faithful defender throughout all my vicissitudes in Vicksburg. Soon after, George came to me in a great state of excitement, and said, "Oh, Miss Mary, a Yankee soldier was just going with our tent fly from the top of the cave, and I made him stop and leave it. Federal soldier came down the side of the hill, stopped, and took my little daughter's hand, and said with some pleasant words to her. He turned to me, touching his hat with a smile, and said, 'Good morning.' I bowed in return, while a lucky thought came to me. Here was a kind-hearted, polite soldier. Why not let him take the tent fly in the place of some undeserving man? So I said, 'Soldier, would you like a tent fly?' He answered, 'Oh, yes, madam, I would like one very much.' So I sent George to get it for him. He expressed himself very grateful, disliked to take it, fearful of robbing us, but I assured him he was welcome, so he again bade me good morning and carried off his acquisition. The Confederate troops were being marched into Vicksburg to take the parole that the terms of the treaty of surrender demanded. In a few days they would leave the city they had held so long. On Friday they began their march toward the south, and on Saturday poor George came to me and said he had put on a pair of blue pants, and thinking they would take him for a Federal soldier, had tried to slip through after Em, but he was turned back, so he came begging me to try and get him a pass. The effort was made, and to this day I do not know whether he ever reached Em or not. Saturday evening Vicksburg, with her terraced hills, with her pleasant homes and sad memories, passed from my view in the gathering twilight. Passed by the river, flowed on the same, and the stars shone out with the same calm light. But the many eyes, O Vicksburg, that have gazed on thy terraced hills, on thy green and sunny gardens, on the flow of the river, the calm of the stars, those eyes, how many thou hast closed on the world forever. So that is the end of my cave life of Vicksburg, but there's a section called Letters of Trial and Travel. Um, so this is from the Gayosa House in Memphis in April 1862. My dear Jay, I am just in from dinner, and you would be amused to see the different faces, I might as well say the different appetites, for the Army of Missouri and Arkansas have been undergoing rigorous fasts of late, and the little episode of the Battle of Elkhorn and the consequent privations have helped not a little the gaunt appearance of these military characters. All eat rapidly, from General V. D. Van Dorn down to the smallest lieutenant, whose manner of playing the epicure over the different dishes ordered is a study. The confidential consultations with the waiter over them, together with the knowing unconsciousness of bestowing his small change, almost convinces me that he is a brigadier general or a colonel, at least. You see streaming in constantly this tide of human beings to eat, stare at the ladies, talk, and order much wine in the excitement of military anecdotes. For you must understand that a civilian is a rare avis amid the brilliant uniforms of the dining room. Yet amid all this mass and huge crowd, the majority are polished gentlemen who are evidently seen much of the world and who are men of purpose and character. General V.D. Van Dorn and staff sit not far from me, looked at rather jealously by the Missourians as ranking and commanding them over their favorite general. Yet he always treats the old general with the utmost consideration and courtesy. On the other side sits General P. with his kind, benevolent face. The poor old gentleman finds at the table his lightest reserves become his heaviest forces. Nearly all his staff are about him. And as I sit half amused at the expression of some faces and thinking deeply of the mute, yet determined impress of character on others, two gentlemen come in, one in plain citizen's clothing with heavy black beard and high forehead, with stooping gait and hands behind him. I am told he is Governor J. of Missouri. His face puzzles me. It is thoughtful and singular. By his side, with tall, lithe, slender figure, fully erect, walks General J.T. You will scarcely think it is possible that this is the so frequently talked of J.T. I thought him an ordinary man. Did you not you? Yet this is anything but an ordinary man. The keen dark eye sweeps the room as he enters, taking us all in at a glance, a quick, daring, decisive, resolute face. I can make nothing more out of him, yet there is more of thought and intellect than you see at first. He is dressed in full uniform with sword and sash, and has quite a military air. There are so many St. Louisians here. You see them scattered around the tables quite plentifully. General C is among the number. He sits some distance and looks quite worn and sad. You know, do you not, that he is the father of young Churchill Clark, who was killed at Elkhorn? Have I told you his history? It is this. He graduated at West Point in the commencement of the war, and knowing and having great admiration for General P, he joined him at once. He was put in command of some artillery, and showing himself a youth of courage and ability, for he was only 20 years old, his command was increased. Throughout the constant trials and sufferings of the campaign, he showed himself equal in courage, daring, and judgment to many older heads. He was particularly beloved by General P. At Elkhorn, as ever, his battery sustained itself with coolness and bravery. As the general rode by, he said some cheering words to young Clark, who took his cap and waved it, saying, "General, we will hold our own," or words to that effect, when a ball sped from the enemy and crashed in the young ardent brain as he spoke. I have been told that the general was affected to tears. He knelt by his side, vainly seeking for some trace of the strong young life, but the pulses were stilled forever, and Churchill Clark lay a stiffened corpse in the long wet grass at Elkhorn. And so his father sits silent and alone, and all respect the grief that none can assuage. In a few days we leave. The gentlemen all go to Corinth, where a battle in all probability will take place before long. Fort Pillow can hardly hold out, under the daily bombardment that we hear from the gunboats, and if it falls, Memphis, on taking leave of the Confederate officers, will usher in the Federal to the quarters in the Gayoso. Adieu. And the next letter says Memphis, April. Dear Jay, again I write you from the Gayosa house, which still teems with Missourians and many ladies, some few from St. Louis. General P.'s parlor is filled with ladies from morning until night. I have been told that on one occasion some ladies, who were the reverse of beautiful, were coming in to see him, when he turned to one of his staff officers and told him that it was his duty to assist him, that here was an opportunity, he must kiss these ladies for him, but the officer was politely deaf until too late. It is astonishing to see how ladies flock to see the old general, and all kiss him as a matter of course. I rode out to the camp of the Missourians with them a few mornings since. It is pleasantly situated near the bank of the river. The men seem to be in good spirits, although moving them across the Mississippi has been an unpopular act. The poor fellows are being taken out to Corinth as fast as transportation can be furnished them. The compliment is paid them of being placed in the most dangerous position, for we daily expect an attack from the Federal forces on Corinth. Would you like to see those who love complimented in this way? You can form no idea of the love and devotion shown by the Missouri troops for the general. I happened to be standing near a window at the end of the hall last evening as some regiment passed by the Gayoso on their way out to the depot, bound for Corinth. General P stood out on the veranda as they passed by, and shouts and cheers for the old general and Missouri rent the air. General J. T. called on me this morning and amused me much with some of his adventures in Missouri last winter. Among others, he told me of his dash toward the little town of Commerce for food. His men were ordered to take a certain amount, lay down the money, and leave. As he sat on a small horse waiting for them, out came the heroine of Commerce, as he called the lady. I've forgotten her name yet. I think it was O'Sullivan. She walked up to the general, shook her clenched hand in his face, and told him he was a robber and a scoundrel. Her husband pulled her by the arm and tried to make her desist, but she was deaf to his entreaties, standing part of the time on one side of the little horse and part of the time on the other, first shaking her clenched hand at him and then standing with arms folded, calling him all manner of names. Some of the officers wished General T to have her confined to her own house until his departure, but he laughed and said, no, let her alone. She still continued hovering around him, threatening and talking. He said, "Oh, Mrs. Sullivan, you are a modest woman, a very modest woman. Madam, don't you think your house stands in need of you?" Powerless fell the irony wherever he went. He was followed by the persistent Mrs. O'Sullivan, stop where he would. Mrs. O'Sullivan was by his side, much to the amusement of his followers. Go where he would, up rose Mrs. O'Sullivan unexpectedly at corners, red-faced and bitter, always in the same belligerent, defiant state. Steamboat was seen coming down the river. General T ordered his men to hide behind a woodpile until it came up, expecting to get supplies from it. When they thought themselves disposed out of sight, General T raised his eyes, and behold, some little distance up the river stood the inevitable Mrs. O'Sullivan, violently gesticulating at the boat and crying, "Turn, turn! J.T. is here!" at the same time waving her apron and sunbonnet in quite a frantic manner. The boat turned indeed, and although the scheme failed, behind the woodpile sat General T, chagrined at the failure, yet laughing most heartily at the attitude and malapropos appearance of Mrs. O'Sullivan. The hotel is crowded with military men, many wounded at the late battle of Shiloh, going around with arms and slings, others supported by crutches. The ladies are seemingly having a very gay time. The halls are filled with promenaders, and the parlors with gay young couples, music and laughter. Yet a sudden surprise has come to all. New Orleans has fallen, an unexpected blow to most of the Southern officers. I cannot but think, as I see all the life and bustle around me, of the different scenes a week or two hence, when the fearful battle of Corinth will have taken place. How many that are now happy and full of life, looking forward with confidence to the laurels that may be won, before the struggle is over, will be silent forever in death, or worse, perhaps. Sorry about that. Um, I'll do this sentence again. How many that are now happy and full of life, looking forward with confidence to the laurels that may be won, before the struggle is over, will be silent forever in death, or worse, perhaps lamed and maimed for life. General Beauregard's works are said to be fine, yet the Federal approachers are said to be greatly superior. My husband goes tomorrow to Corinth, and I will go to Mississippi, to await the result of what all seem to think will be a most bloody struggle. I will write on reaching O. Until then, farewell. So this is from O. Oxford, May 1st. The expected battle has not yet come off, and I am still awaiting the result, busying myself about many things, visiting and returning visits from my old friends, dividing my time between the world and the hospital, the lights and shades of life. Ah, the shades! My dear J., you can little imagine how much suffering I have witnessed in the last few weeks, how much that acts or kind words have no power to mitigate. There have been many wounded brought in from Corinth, many who have died since their arrival, many who will die, but saddest of all, a young boy, too young to be a soldier, yet possessing all the soldier spirit. I walked into a ward one morning that I had visited the evening before, a ward of very sick patients, and saw an old man sitting by a new cot fanning a young boy who lay with flushed face and burning eyes fixed on the ceiling. As I advanced toward them, the weather bronzed man stood stiffly erect, making me a quaint, half awkward military salute, saying as he did so, "My boy, ma'am, is he wounded?" I asked. He threw back the sheet that covered him, pointed to the stump of the limb amputated near the thigh. "He has gained the cross," he said, while his head grew more erect as he held back the sheet with the fan, and his eyes shot out the grim ghost of a smile. A proud iron soldier the man was, I could see. The boy was delirious, so I shall tell you of the man. Refusing to be seated as long as the lady remained standing in the room, he stood stiffly upright at the head of the cot, keeping each fly from the face of the boy with the tenderness of a mother. A limp brown hat was on the side of his head, shading his eyes, that followed me with all parts of the room. A red cord and tassel hung from one side of his hat and gave him a jaunty air that was quite out of keeping with the quaint stiffness of his manner. After speaking to the sick and wounded soldiers around, asking after their wounds and wants, I returned to the young boy's cot and heard the old man's story. Don't be weary if I give it to you. He had so much pride in his boy. Let that be my extenuation. We belonged to the Texas Rangers, ma'am, the boy and me. He could ride as well as the rest of them, ma'am, a year ago. When the war broke out and we practiced regularly like, he was the best rider in the company, could pick anything he wanted off the ground as he was going. He's only 14, ma'am, a fine grown lad indeed. His mother was the likeliest woman I ever seed. With a deprecating bow to me, he's got her eyes, the finest eyes God had ever made, she had, ma'am. She died when quite young, like leaving him to me, a little shaver, and he's been by me ever since. The boys and me tried to overpersuade him out of the army. 'Peared like he was too young for such business, but he wouldn't hear to it. Not he, ma'am, and here he is," passing his sleeve across his eyes. "Well, ma'am, so he stayed with us, and when we got to Corinth, General Beauregard offered a cross of honor to the ones that showed themselves the best soldiers. So our boys talked a heap about who'd get it, but this boy says nothing. Well, one day we were ordered out to scout, and we came up with the Yankees, and we fed 'em half an hour or so, when I seed this youngster by my side kind of drooping by a tree, but standing his ground. Well, we routed them at last, when I found the boy's leg was all shattered, and he'd keep up like nothing wasn't the matter. So when we went back to Corinth, it got noised about like from the soldiers to the officers. How he held out, and more'n all, the time when his leg was being cut off, we couldn't get any chloroform, morphine, or the like. He just sit up like a brave lad, and off it went without a word out of him. So the doctors they talked to that, and he's been notified that he'll get the first cross, and the boys will be monstrous fond of him, and feel most like they'd got it themselves. If he'd get rid of his fever and pick up like, I'd be a happy man," he said anxiously. "Pardon me, do I tire you? But let me take you to visit the sick prisoners. The old man that we pass in the hall with his arm and leg in a frame will never recover. Yet he does not know it, and frequently asks me if I think he will get a pension when he is well, if he loses his leg and arm. He persists in keeping his face covered with a handkerchief, raising it up and peeping out as if he hears my voice each day with his usual salutation, 'You've come, have ye?' If I bring any little article of food that I think the patients will relish, this old man must be fed by me, and I am frequently amused at the directions he gives me, for he is extremely practical and particular. Now, if you turn my mouth in this direction, and the custard will pass safely in." Poor man without a friend, both arms badly wounded and legs shattered, dying by degrees, yet to the last the handkerchief would be raised and the cheery welcome greets me. "You come, have ye?" I think I can see you looking around in this ward to learn which are the prisoners, for all seem cheerful and talkative. In this cot by the door, with a wounded limb in the frame, like a huge lion, lies a man, large whiskered, large bodied, and long limbed. yet with a pleasant smile of greeting as we enter and make our inquiries after his wound. He is better this morning, thank you, or I am obliged to you, not quite so well. A little picture on the table by his side of a child 3 years of age is never closed. A little child, blue-eyed, with bare white neck and the plump round arms, showing the mother's wish that the picture should be fair and lovely to the father's eye. The Federal flag is on the cover. The man, a captain, is of an Illinois company. The child and mother, with tearful eyes and wistful hearts, look over the wide expanse of land and water that separates, over the cruel bounds that man has set, still faithful in their love, still watching and hoping for the time when liberty will be his, and he, constant and true, will return to them. He tells me the name of the little one, with a sorrowful look at me with his dark eye. If he is free, if he ever sees these words, he will remember how the little one was gazed on by a lady in deep mourning, to whose heart a child of 3 years brought a sad and tearful memory. Come to the next cot with me. Do not shrink from the blackened brow. Yesterday this was a noble-faced, gray-haired old Confederate soldier, with the plaintive, lovely smile of perfect resignation. He suffers much from a wound in his body, seldom talks, yet he always smiles gratefully for the slightest attention. This morning I find the uh, erysipelas has broken out, spreading over his forehead and a part of his face. He cautions me with the same pleasant, resigned smile, and after coming near him, lest I take the disease. The blackened skin is from the effect of iodine to stay its progress. He will not live. Dear patient old man, my heart aches for him, yet I can give him nothing but kind words. This morning I brought the men in this ward toast. The old man slept, and I gave to each his portion. Engaged in talking to a prisoner in another part of the room, I heard the Illinoisan say, "Let me divide this toast with you. I do not need it all." I turned and heard the old man reply, "Oh, no, you keep it." I procured his toast and brought it to him, laughing, telling the prisoner, I believed I saw the dawn of the millennium. Do you not wish, dear Jay, that the dawning was indeed with us, that brave and noble men should no more suffer, bleed, and die, but live, and in their lives grow more thankful and worthy of the divine blood that has been shed for the removal of the fearful suffering and warfare that is all around us? Pardon me for the length of time I have detained you, and remember me as ever, dear Jay, yours. The next letter is from O, Oxford, June 1862. Can you credit it, dear Jay? General Beauregard has evacuated Corinth. You have learned it by this time through the papers, and share with me the surprise. Our feelings have fluctuated with the news from Corinth for weeks. First, an engagement would probably ensue the following day. Then some had heard heavy guns and was sure that the battle had taken place. And the next day all quiet at Corinth. But the most astonishing of all, for we were prepared for everything besides, Corinth has been left quietly, absolutely left, and the Federal troops probably occupy the place. Every one has something to say on this subject, and all are but more brilliant in their ideas for the reason that all but full scope to exercise them. No one possesses reliable information, and we are conjecturing community, gentlemen as well as ladies. Something out of the common order of affairs, you will say. But a truce to politics, of which I am very fond, and like most women, know very little about. Why should a woman of sense care to talk about anything but dress and her servant? So I attended a pleasant little soiree a few evenings since, graced by the fair and elegant daughters of General P. of Tennessee, and the young bride of Jacob J.'s only son, a sweet young girl. All were in full evening dress, though the guests were few. But a novelty, listen. A young Spanish bride, a brilliant woman, dazzled my eyes for the evening. Conversing only in her beautiful national language, she was animated gestures fascinates and enlightens one readily in relation to her themes. Then she warbles most beautifully, and one can scarcely complain that her higher notes lack in power. As she rises from the instrument, placing her hand on her heart, saying brokenly the only English words she is a mistress of, "Oh, pity me, pity," with an arch reverence to her audience. I am troubled about our poor hospital patients. the one-third of whom you have not met with me. Each has a separate individuality that interests me exceedingly. It is feared that the Federal troops will advance on O, and the patients will be removed to a safer place below. I will be sorry to see them leave, poor fellows. The boy that gained a double cross at Corinth has closed his eyes softly and calmly. Suffering will never disturb him more. He is dead. The old man has gone back to his company with spasm of pain in his heart, of which the world will never know. Let me tell you of the man's devotion. The boy's fever still raged, with slightly and slighter intervals. The medicine failed to procure the desired effect. The physicians looked anxious as they approached his cot. I wanted to take the old man's hand and tell him of the friend in heaven, from whom death itself can never separate us, but a foolish fear withheld me. One night the physicians met around the little cot, the old man as usual, and others were near, standing stiffly at the head, yet with alarmed and burning eyes, intently reading each face. A sad reading, hopeless, the eyes told that, while the hands sought the faintly beating pulse. "Doctor, may I try to save my boy my own way?" said the old man, following the physician into the hall. "Yes, do as you choose with him, only do not give him unnecessary pain." In the morning a large tub of cold water was taken to the ward and placed by the sick boy's cot, and the dismay of the soldiers in the beds around, the boy was lifted out, wounded as he was, by the strong and gentle arms of one in whose eyes he was more precious than the rarest of diamonds and gold. A quick douse, and he was rubbed well, covered closely, and soon slept soundly, the perspiration breaking out profusely for the first time in 2 days. He was decidedly better, and the proud smile on the father's face was a happy thing to see. Gradually he grew more feeble, the fever returned, and one morning, with an aching heart, I saw the calmness of death in the closed eyes and motionless nostril. Standing at the head of the bed, his hat drawn over his eyes, his arms folded in a stern and patient agony, the father stood watching Yap most faithfully. I cannot express to you the grief that my sympathy brought, the grief and constantly the words, "Alone, all alone, my boy, oh my boy." The ladies wished to have a large funeral over the brave young soldier, but the physicians would not consent to having him buried in town, saying that the soldiers were all worthy of attention and that no distinction could be allowed. So before he was buried, I went out to the hospital and looked my last on the young dead face, from which all trace of suffering had fled. Only peace and rest now forever. Pain and anguish were making a deep impress on the face of the man by the head. The drawn lines of watching and suffering were more evident as with strained smile. The almost a gasp of pain. He thanked me for the interest he had taken. "Everybody is so kind," he said. He had gone into town that morning and purchased a little black coat, placing it on the small form. A black velvet vest, white bosom, and the cravat tied over the white, boyish throat told of the tenderness that shrank not from the coldness of death. "He's like his mother, ma'am, more than ever now," he whispered, softly drawing the sheet over the inanimate form and turning squarely around with his back to me. I saw him draw again and again his sleeve across his eyes. "We are born to this human sorrow, and yet it is an appalling thing to me. You have expressed an interest in these visits to the wounded and dying, therefore I speak. One more life that hovers over the grave, one more who has suffered, oh, I cannot express to you how much. A prisoner from Iowa, belonging to the 2nd Iowa Cavalry, was captured at Farmington near Corinth, shot through the body so badly that very little hope was entertained of his recovery. He lingered some weeks and dwindled from a robust, hardy man down to a poor, emaciated being, seldom talking, never complaining, yet suffering much, I could see. When I came one morning, the ward master whispered aside to me that he had been dying through the night. I entered the ward, his eyes sought mine with a wistful look and brightened as I came near his bed. I smoothed the hair from his forehead, moistened his lips, and then, taking the fly brush, resolved to stay by him to the last. Oh, dear Jay, those wistful eyes that followed every motion of mine, those anxious, dying eyes. What was the poor mother doing now of whom he whispered to me? How little she knew that the eyes that were so dear now were looking their last on the light. Far away from home and friends, among strangers, the soul was swiftly passing out into the great sea of eternity, the bright hopes of which so softly regulate this life tide of ours, passing out with the lingering look of unfathomable speech into my face, for my face told him what my lips faltered in doing. If I can write to your mother before you are free, what shall I say? You know, he whispered, you are very sick, and God may not spare your life. You will say one little prayer after me. And so a few words were said, that with long pauses he whispered after me, almost gasping at the last word. And thus beside him I sat, the gaze from his eyes into mine growing more and more intense. It seemed as if his whole soul was drawn out in unutterable language. At length the quivering eyelid, the softly fleeting breath, ebbing out, yes, ebbing out so swiftly. O Father, give this tried soul thy rest, through thy dear Son. Free at last, prisoner, peace to thy soul, God grant us peace. My friend, do you dread death? I have seen it come so often as a relief from pain and distress that I could not but bless it. Do not forget that you asked for these details, and believe, as I wish you always to, in my affection, yours. It is long since I have heard from you, dear Jay, long since I have written. You will notice that I am again at O. Soon after, writing my last, the Federal troops took possession of Holly Springs and threatened O. The hospital patients were removed, uh, and I crossed the country to meet my husband, who was at Tupelo. After spending some time in Pontotoc, I continued on to Tupelo, and for some time remained on a plantation 6 miles distant. Meantime, the battle of Iuka occurred, and the loss of the brave General Little was deeply felt by the Missourians. The troops returned in dejection. Shortly they were marched across to Ripley, where a junction was formed with the troops under General Van D. An attack was made on Corinth, in which the troops behaved gallantly, but all to no purpose. A complete repulse proved, and the army under the two generals narrowly escaped capture. The wives and families of the officers were of course distressed and anxious. Couriers daily came galloping into the town with the most conflicting reports. At one time we heard that the Missourians were completely cut to pieces, again that they were all captured. One of the couriers said he had seen my husband lying in an ambulance as he passed. How much distressed I was, you can imagine. Yet 2 days passed wearily along and still no tidings. The evening of the second day, as I sat in the moonlight on the portico, I heard a vehicle coming down the road with great speed. As it neared the house, I saw that it was an ambulance. My worst fears now took shape and form. Am wounded, perhaps mortally wounded, I thought, and I ran swiftly down the walk. The driver met me at the gate, telling me that he had been sent with all speed after me, that Tupelo would be evacuated during the night, and my husband had written to the post quartermaster, placing me in his charge. I also had a letter. The quartermaster would take me over to the quartermaster would take me over to the country with the wagon train at daylight in the morning. My husband was well, he answered to my first earnest inquiry. It was now 9 o'clock. My little daughter was in bed sleeping soundly. The man, a sergeant who was well known to my husband, had, as yet, not supped. So while he ate, I gathered my baggage together, wrapped a shawl around my sleeping child. Then, with a hurried good-bye, we drove off 6 miles through the woods, through what had been an impassable swamp. Now the gloom of the huge trees brought to my mind all the thrilling tales I had heard of travelers being waylaid in swamps and dense woods. I looked at the shadows of the trunks of trees and imagined a man skulked in the darkness behind them. The owls were crying mournfully, and the plaintive song of the whippoorwill came to us from the dense recesses of the forest. My servant crept closely to my side, for negroes in their vivid imaginations fill the woods at night with phantoms and ghosts of the departed. Frequently, after detailing the events of the recent battle to us, our driver in the full moonlight would break the silence with one of his stirring camp airs, whistling loud and shrilly. Then my martial and political hopes would rise. But as we have again plunged into the darkness of the rugged cypress trees, where the owl and whippoorwill vied with each other, a silence would again come over us, and I again became a timid, fearful woman. Soon we saw lights through the trees, then the row of campfires, and noise and bustle became the prominent features of the town. Cattle were driven through with many a shout and halloo. Wagons were passing rapidly. Soldiers were cooking rations at the campfires, a scene of busy preparation. We drove to the quartermaster's office, and the gentleman conducted us in, regretting that they had been obliged to send for me in such a summary manner. The order to move had come at night, and since then they had been employed constantly, as the town must be evacuated by daylight, for the Federal forces were advancing rapidly. The house was an unfinished building. One large, long room comprised the second story, with a small portion partitioned off and dignified by the name of office. To this I, with my servant, was conducted through piles of mule collars, harness, bridles, etc. Here I was glad to find a little camp cot, on which I laid my child for the first time out of my arms. With many apologies for the poor accommodations they had to offer me, the gentlemen took their leave, and I could hear the quick orders to clerks, drivers, and soldiers, as they recommenced their hurried preparations. I took my knitting and sat by the window. The moon was low in the heavens, yet the tumult continued throughout the town. My child slept peacefully, our father many miles away, yet I knew filled with anxiety for our welfare. At dawn we were on our way. The first night I slept in Pontotoc at a friend's house. The gentleman camped out of town about a mile. In the morning, before I had left my room, my friends called and left a message for me with the lady of the house. I was to start as soon as I could and strive to gain the head of the wagon train, thereby escaping the dust. Our driver was a soldier from Arkansas, a quiet, mild little man with very little force. We drove on briskly in the pleasant morning air for 2 or 3 hours and saw nothing of the train. Perhaps we were before them. Presently we stopped and held a consultation. In every opinion that I expressed in regard to the matter, I found a ready echo from the little man, pro and con. We had driven perhaps too rapidly. No signs of the wagons could we find. Waiting patiently for a time, a disagreeable foreboding crossed my mind. I had not been told which road to take. There were two. Perhaps we were on the wrong one. O was 40 miles from Pontotoc. We had already gone 9, and could not now return expecting to find our friends. The only alternative was to drive through to O, where M designed meeting us. So in answer to the little man's query, "Don't you think we'd better whip up and try to make O by night?" I said yes. Clouds began to overspread the sky, and I heard mutterings of thunder in the distance. Still the sun shone out fitfully, and I hoped the rain would not fall near us. Driving on with speed, we had proceeded but a few miles when the unmistakable evidences of a storm that would soon burst upon us convinced me that a shelter must be sought. Where it was hard to tell, for the road we traveled was almost destitute of houses. I was in despair as the wind whistled around us, driving in eddies the leaves and dried grass about the ground, and swaying high and low with a moaning sound the limbs of the huge forest trees. In my anxiety, I grasped at a straw. I remembered in traveling this road before that M had pointed out by a road through the woods that led to Lafayette Springs. The proprietor knew my husband, and I resolved to take a country road that I saw leading in the direction I imagined the springs to be. Picture me, Jay, if you can, sitting up in the center of the ambulance, my servant by my side, little Jay between us, the little driver meek and resigned, turning when I said turn, stopping when I said stop. Taking a strange road, I knew not where, we drew near at last a most unpromising looking cabin, the inhabitants of which filled the door with the sound of wheels, in every variety of size, robed in yellow dresses surmounted by tangled white heads. The old lady knew there was some spring somewhere abouts, and reckoned this road might run there. Then, resuming her pipe, looked for confirmation of the statement to her eldest daughter, who said, yes, she reckoned the road would take us there, if we kept straight ahead. "With the mules," I cried, "and drive rapidly," for the storm was darkening around us, and the ambulance jingled a chorus through the silent piney woods. Large drops were now falling. The wind moaned and surged mournfully through the barren mound and swept over the narrow road, whirling the pine points as we passed. Faster and faster fell the rain. Our heavier clothing, shawls, cloaks, etc., were with the trunks. One light shawl, in which I enveloped my child, was all possessed in this emergency. The ambulance cover was dotted with bullet holes, through which the rain dropped in cold relentlessness. The little driver was suffering martyrdom, drawn up as closely as possible with his blanket around him, the wind driving the rain in sheets between him and the mules. He looked to me in the mist like an inanimate round brown ball. Soon the floor of the ambulance filled so rapidly with water that he threw his blanket over the top of the conveyance to keep the rain from falling through. Then subsiding again, the only sign of life about the little being was the mechanical process of whipping the mules. A little side road presented itself, loading into the forest, freshly marked with wagon tracks. Hearing the barking of a dog not far distant, I ordered the driver to turn in search of a house. Proceeding a quarter of a mile, we came to another little cabin. Through the rain, the weak voice of the little driver brought to the door a woman who informed us that Lafayette Springs was 3 miles on ahead. Highly elate, the little man turned to me and said with a glad face, saying, "Very good news," whipped up his mules, and I firmly believe the man was nearsighted, for in 2 minutes more we could have gone off a precipice that was almost hidden by the tops of trees that grew far below at the base. "Stop!" I cried, as the heads of the mules were almost over the verge of the cliff. The little man meekly asked what he should do. "Back the mules!" I cried, and after a troublesome detention we at last turned and found ourselves on the road again. "We like to had a right smart that time there," said the little man to me. "We did indeed," I returned blandly, for I feared I had hurt the poor man's feelings in speaking so quickly at that critical time. Gladly we reached the Springs through the driving rain, and were pleasantly welcomed. The landlord did all that he could for my comfort. I had the pleasure of meeting a friend who had met my husband and who had told me much about the recent battle. The next morning we started again. I determined, although it was a raw, disagreeable morning, to be done with my lonely wanderings. We had gone about 4 miles, shivering in the dismal mist, when I heard a quick galloping along the road. The curtain of the ambulance was lifted, a blithe good morning in a voice I could not mistake. Em was riding up by our side, asking how on earth we had contrived to wander so far off from our friends. I could answer nothing to this bantering. Corinth, with all its bloody horrors that had been so vividly before my mind, the constant anxiety I had felt, and now my tribulations were ended. Am in person here to take charge of us. I covered my face and cried like a silly child. Do not blame me. You have never been lost in the woods in a storm, and felt the responsibility of every action rested with you. M had been sent on business to Pontotoc, had heard of us there, and followed, fearing that we might have met with some accident. I will accompany M in a few days to Holly Springs, where Generals P, V, and L are entrenching with their forces. As I write, the sunlight fades away, and only the fading crimson light lies across my paper. In closing, let me entreat you to remember always as you read my affection for you, as ever. And then I think this is the last. Nope, couple more letters. Okay, this one's from Holly Springs. You wish me to keep a journal for you, dear Jay, but I answered that a journal would be a dull compound of dates with 3 lines setting forth the vapidity of most days, and I would rather write events as much as they passed. You reply that my letters must be voluminous if they were satisfactory. Do you not already repent the remark? I rejoice if length is pleasing. My letters are satisfactory. The Battle of Corinth was a bloody failure. Oh, the blood that was flowed in this wonderful and most appalling warfare, the tears and the suffering! Can there be nothing done to assuage the fierce passions of men? Oh, Jay, could you see, as I have, the torn and mangled human beings brought from the field of battle with loud cries to God for death, for mercy, and for death? You, like me, would ask anxiously, can nothing do away with this death, this anguish? Can no appeal be made by which peace may come to us? But woman weeps while man strikes. Holly Springs, with its white verandaed houses, its pleasant gardens, wide streets, and hospitable homes, is the most pleasant of Southern towns, though crowded and teeming with soldiers and officers. The inhabitants seem uniting in the efforts to entertain. Generals V, D, P, L, and T have each their respective headquarters in the town. A week ago, I attended a review of the soldiers under Generals L and T. They presented a fine appearance. Most of them were newly uniformed and renovated from their prison clothing. General V.D. Van Dorn, who is called the finest horseman in the army, galloped up and down the line on a fleet, beautiful black horse, followed by General P. on a large bay that galloped heavily and with less speed. There were many ladies present on horseback, scattered around the field, with generally a gay group of officers surrounding them. Day before yesterday, we rode out to a large review of the Missouri troops under General P. There were spectators from the whole country around. Many came up on the cars from a distance. Some imperishable renown have the Missouri troops gained in the late battle of Corinth, that all are anxious to witness their review and cheer the brave fellows who have suffered so much. Although driven back and obliged to retreat, their gallant struggle over 2 rows of superior fortifications in the face of galling fire, the Southern people will never forget. General P is greatly loved by the people, though the heads of the government are strongly opposed to him. It is natural, of course, that President Davis should suppose a regularly educated military man who would be more likely to understand the science of war than a man who has not made it his study. But why does he cripple so efficient an officer as General P certainly is, so as almost to render him inefficient? The Missourians on review looked fresh and lively. General P, attended by his staff, stood near us in the pause while we waited on the arrival of General V.D. One of General P's staff officers started across the field to carry a dispatch, when his horse, stumbling, fell in the grass, rolling the brilliantly uniformed gentleman over and over on the sod, much to the amusement of the spectators, who cheered him lustily. I felt sorry for him, and although some of his friends were talking to me at the time, I could scarcely conceal a smile. But the men who half a mile distant had been drawn in line, now wheel, form, and march around the little hillock in the distance. See, the sun glances on the bayonets of the guns as they ascend, and in coming down over the brow of the hill, the regular swing of the line and glance of the steel show the discipline they have been under. Now they pass by the general, who sits a little behind General V.D. and near General Q. Among the artillery, I saw the Lady Richardson captured and brought away from Corinth. As they come on and pass by General V.D., they salute, which is answered by his raising his cap to the colors, disclosing a proud youthful head surrounded by curls. He is immediately before me, and I do not see his face, which is marked with deep lines I have noticed before. In the evening, after the review, I attended a party given to the generals here collected. The house was crowded. The generals with their staff and other officers were there, and some of the lovely ladies of Holly Springs. The supper was handsome. Toasts were drunk to Generals P and V.D., and all went merry, etc. But in the midst of a conversation, an officer told me that the Federal forces were advancing on Holly Springs, and that probably the Confederate forces would evacuate the town in a day or two. So, dear J., there is no telling where I will be when I write next. And then the last letter. Yeah, this is the last letter. It's from Jackson. I know you are smiling as you see Jackson written at the head of my letter, smiling to me how systematically I have bowed myself out of one town after the other, as the Federal troops have bowed themselves in. Yet, you know the old saw, he that fights and runs away, etc. Though I take no comfort in this, as fighting has been my abomination since the war began, I have always in peaceful times had an admiration for heroes in brilliant uniforms, and would now, if the hero could possibly assure me that the brilliant uniform would always be filled with life. But how can one feel a pleasure in the gilt trappings of a friend, when they know that they may possibly serve as an anxiously sought target for some sharpshooter? You do not wonder at my quotation in favor of a retrograde movement in this frame of mind, do you? For the last week or two I have passed from one state of excitement to another, so that I am glad indeed to find a quiet resting place. From Holly Springs the army under Generals V, D, and P retreated to Abbeville, where they remained stationary for a time. One day the inhabitants of O were alarmed by the distant booming of cannon. A great excitement prevailed, and various rumors went rounds. One that the Federal troops had reached the Tallahatchie, another that they had crossed and a battle was progressing between the Federals and Confederate forces. The town grew wide awake, wagons passed and repassed. Numerous families were seen walking rapidly toward the depot, carriages filled with ladies and children driving swiftly in the same direction. My friends were preparing to leave also. I received a telegram from M telling me to be in readiness to take my departure during the afternoon. My preparations were made. A gentleman came down the down train to accompany me, when to our great disappointment passengers were not allowed to go on the train, for the hospital patients were all to be taken off before passengers could be accommodated. My friend was, however, by particular favor, allowed to ride in a baggage car with my trucks. The next day, Sunday, how little it seemed that the Sabbath, passenger trains were to run if the stores could all be transported. So a number of friends with myself took our seats quite early in the cars at the depot and waited patiently hour after hour, hearing most distracting rumors until my patience had become nearly exhausted. In the afternoon, great was my joy on seeing M enter the car. The army was retreating from Abbeville. Our friends resolved to take their carriage and cross the country to Columbus. M said he could not get an ambulance for me, but I would be obliged to keep up with the army as the Federal forces were following closely. The cars were vacated quickly, and I saw the last of my friends. An ambulance came up, and I was soon riding rapidly southward. That night we stopped at a roadside house. During the next day the greater portion of the army passed by and encamped below the house we were in for the night. The next morning was gloomy, dark, and disagreeable. While I waited for M to come with an ambulance, General P invited me to ride with him. The roads were in the most miserable condition, and for a time we drove on a corduroy road. Just imagine me, dear J., on a corduroy road, jolting through a swamp with my child in my arms, the General talking in the calmest and most urbane manner. Yet the gloom of the day was over me, and I felt dismally miserable. Soon the rain began to pour in. We were at this time on the high road, which became every moment worse from the travel of the artillery, and greater portion of which was before us. Immediately behind the general's ambulance drove the carriage of a lady who had been compelled, like myself, to abandon the cars. How incessantly the rain poured down! Now and then the ambulance would drive on the side of the road, stopping to let the infantry pass. Poor fellows, wet and begrimed with mud, plodding with blankets and knapsacks strapped on their backs and guns on their shoulders, troublesome accompaniments at any time, far more so now in the driving rain. At the foot of the hills we would frequently be obliged to halt, sometimes for an hour, awaiting the passage of the artillery over the brow of the ascent. The Federal troops were close in the rear. The horse strained and pulled, but the mud was so deep and heavy that the wheels became clogged, and I looked anxiously up, expecting to see some huge cannon, compelled by its weight, return to the base of the hill. Frequently the soldiers would be obliged to wade through the deep ruts of mud on the hillside, and give a new impulse to some wavering piece, assisting the horses and pushing the weighty gun carriage with united strength. In the rain sat the staff officers on their other dripping horses, and giving orders from the ambulance window, the old general urged on the men. I wondered at the patience, the kindness with which he spoke to all, rapidly and cheerily to the staff officers. Ride on and see what obstructs the road, and in a tone of sympathy through the rain to the straggling soldier. Keep up, men, keep up. We camp near, do we? He called in clear tones to the inspector, and the men raised their drooping heads and pressed forward at the encouragement in the well-known voice. I see the power of kindness with these men, dear J. There are few general officers in the Confederacy so well beloved by their men as General P. Yet he is only kind and perfectly just. That night we stopped beyond Water Valley at a house where the poor hostess tried to make us comfortable and gave us much of her company, telling us that she was cousin to Stonewall Jackson's wife and Hill's wife, and she reckoned they did not know it and wouldn't think much of it if they did. She brought in a large baby and sat down by the general's side, telling them she was going to name that baby after him. The general was as affable as usual, and I frequently turned to the window to conceal my amusement. Suddenly I was startled by her turning quickly to me and asking if I would ever think of her any kin to Stonewall Jackson's wife and Hill's wife. Never having seen either of the above named ladies, I conscientiously answered I did not know, as I should. Wakened by the bugle call the next morning, I hastily arose and in a few moments was ready to depart. We had proceeded but the 5 miles when an aide de camp rode up and told General P. that General Pemberton wished him to return to Water Valley immediately, as the Federal forces were quite near and the Confederate soldiers must make a stand. We alighted and sat a few moments in a negro cabin. Then the general mounted and rode toward Water Valley, followed by his staff officers. The lady and myself proceeded on the wagons beyond Coffeyville, where the train halted and prepared to camp for the night. As yet, I had not heard from M. since he rode off with the general, and I scarcely knew what to do. The soldiers were thrown out on picket duty around the trains, as the Federal force was also to the left of us, nearing the little town of Charleston. Heavy skirmishing was going on at Water Valley, we were told. As no house was near, the gentleman who had charge of the lady and myself told us that he would put up a pleasant tent and make us quite comfortable. So a tent was pitched on a little hillock near, and I rested comfortably during the night. Early in the morning we were on our way, the remainder of the army having come up. At length we reached Grenada in safety, yet sorely pressed by the Federal troops. Thus you see, dear J., that I am unlucky enough to be identified with some retreat of threatened city. From Memphis or over greater distance that separates us, we can span our love, and through all, I am yours. So that's the end of the book. For those that took the time to listen to both videos, I really appreciate it. And I wish everybody a safe spring as we have to endure this crisis that we're going through. Have a good night.